Thank you, everybody, for coming today or watching at home. Today we have Kristy Lai, a developmental psychology PhD student. And so whenever you're ready, Kristy, take it away.
Awesome. Thank you, Ayana. And thank you all for being here. I'm excited to share the work that we've been doing. And so I'll share my screen. If at any moment folks have any clarifying questions, please feel free to jump in and ask. But I'll also be taking questions at the end. Awesome. Okay. Share. And everyone can see the slides. So I'll dive right into it. Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Kristy Lai. I'm a fourth year applied developmental psychology PhD student here at NYU, and I'm so excited to be sharing my work here at the Psych Café. Today, I'll be sharing work I presented at the International Symposium of Bilingualism in San Sebastian, Spain this summer that really focused on how we adapted an existing vocabulary inventory tool we use with children in infancy and toddlerhood called the MacArthur-Bates Communicative Development Inventory. And so the goal of this was really to create these matched inventories for bilingual or dual language learners across English, Spanish, and Mandarin. Okay. So the communicative development inventories, or what I'll refer to as the CDIs, are widely popular caregiver reports. They're used to assess infant and toddlers' early receptive and expressive vocabulary, so what they understand and what they're able to say. They're available in many, many languages, as you can see, and they're available in both short forms and also long forms of the same kind of instrument. But most CDI forms were created and normed on monolingual samples. And as you can see on the right, the word lists in different languages do not have matched items. For example, maybe in English and Spanish, these forms might ask children if they know the word meow for cat sounds. But that concept is completely excluded from the Mandarin short forms. And because of this, researchers who work with bilingual children, which are the majority of children in the world now, right, are often using separate forms, for example, one English form, and then another non-matching Mandarin form to assess the vocabulary of, let's say, one English Mandarin dual language learner's vocabulary. And this essentially is treating bilinguals as if they're two separate monolinguals when it comes to their language ability. But as we know, they are not. And so our project's goal has been to first develop a matched inventory for dual language learners across these very commonly spoken languages of English, Spanish, and Mandarin, assess the validity of these matched inventories for dual language learners, and then evaluate the feasibility of using these matched inventories with real families with bilingual children. And so for the first goal of developing the matched inventories, a team of over a dozen native English, Spanish, and English Mandarin speakers here at NYU met regularly across many weeks to match the short form CDIs across the three languages, row by row. And we did this for both level 1 forms that are created for infants and also level 2 forms, which are created for toddlers. We used a spreadsheet that was set up just like this, where each row represents a concept, and we noted the category and the source that we pulled words from. And so that filling in process looked something like this. And we first filled in all the cells for which original English, Spanish, or Mandarin CDI short forms had words for. And as you can see, there are many missing cells indicating kind of that non-matchingness that I prefaced earlier. After filling these in, our team of bilingual researchers would start pulling words from those original English, Spanish, and Mandarin long forms to populate these missing cells. And so from kind of the longer forms of these inventories, there actually might have been kind of these translation equivalents that aren't included in their abbreviated forms. And so from those extended inventories, we were able to pull most of the matches and we were able to match these short forms almost. But there are a lot of cells, like the one here on the bottom right, that stayed empty, which indicated that there was no existing translational equivalent across any of the forms. And so that's when our team came in and we discussed across English and Spanish and Mandarin teams, right? What word really best matches the concept of a train sound, for example, across the three languages? And to indicate that source, we just marked it as a dash, just saying that our team created these matches. And as you can see, returning to those Venn diagrams we looked at before, after matching, those large number of non-overlapping words across the three languages jump down to single digits. You may also notice that the match list retained all the words from the original short forms so that researchers could still generate those percentile scores that they might have if they were just using the original forms. And so you don't lose any data. And as folks may have suspected, matching across three languages brought to light a lot of challenges that resulted in hours and hours of discussion amongst our team of bilingual researchers. And so to summarize some of the main challenges our team ran into, first, of course, there were different linguistic structures across our three languages. So for example, sentence final particles is something that exists in Mandarin, but not so much in English and Spanish. Also, there were culturally specific words, like, for example, the names of children's games that don't translate necessarily well. Like, for example, how would you even translate patty cake, right? But we found that there were culturally adapted versions, like in Spanish, ojitos, or in Mandarin, ni pai wo pai. And so those were matched on the same row because you can't necessarily translate patty cake and make that make sense in English. I'm sorry, in Spanish or Mandarin. And then there were also dialectical variants. So for example, we provided multiple translation equivalents in Mandarin for the word bathroom because we were going to use this form here in the United States, and we know that Mandarin speakers here in the US come from many different dialectical regions of the world that speak Mandarin, and they use very different words colloquially to refer to bathroom when they're speaking with their children, right? And so all those words were included so that we didn't kind of give credit for one way of saying bathroom, but not give credit to a child that maybe say bathroom a different way. And so from this, it really reiterated to us as researchers and people who just want to have measures that better reflect kind of the realities of families, is that it's so deeply important to not just have a team that was multilingual, but also a team that represented many different dialectical regions of Spanish, Mandarin, and English. Our second goal, after, of course, developing matched forms, we can't just use them willy-nilly. We know that translation equivalents do not guarantee that those matched words have the same level of difficulty across the languages, right? And so we assess the validity of these matched inventories for dual language learners. And with our final match lists, we were able to luckily pull on these open source uh, CDI data that are stored in places like WordBank and WebCDI to test our measures' psychometric properties. And so here are some details of kind of the data that we were able to pull from the various sources. And the specific analyses that we ran to ensure that our newly matched bilingual forms have comparable difficulties to those original forms that were non-matching, we first used item response theory to estimate two things: item difficulty, and in this case, it would be how hard is a specific word for children to understand or say, and then item discrimination, which is how well an item, or in this case, a word, differentiates between children's with different levels of language abilities. And then after we performed an item response theory analysis, we also tested correlations between simulated scores from our matched forms and scores that are stored in WordBank and WebCDI for the original CDI forms to see if there's this kind of correlation and convergence in the scores you would get from those different forms. And so that was convergent validity tests. And so focusing on the IRT analysis first, here you see charts of hypothetical item characteristic curves, or ICCs, where the x-axes on both of these represent the latent trait, which is language ability in the form of reported comprehension or production score, so what they understand and words that they're able to say. And then the y-axis shows the percent of children who know that word, right? And so on the A panel, you see that's representing the difficulty parameter. And as an item shifts to the right on the x-axis, it becomes more difficult, meaning only children with higher overall language ability will know or use that word. So the word street is harder than the word spoon, and street and spoon are harder than the word cookie on panel A. Now moving to panel B, where we kind of compare the discrimination abilities of these words on our list. The steepness of the curve shows how well a word can distinguish between children with varying language abilities or vocabs. A steeper curve means the word is better at separating children with higher and lower vocabulary levels. So the word bathroom, in this case, is more effectively distinguishing between children who have low versus high vocabulary scores as assessed by the CDI. And overall, when we ran these tests, we saw that our matched bilingual inventories appear to have words that are very similar in difficulty and discrimination, but they were just slightly more challenging. So they were higher in difficulty levels, but they were better at distinguishing between children with different language abilities. Then we tested the convergent validity by seeing if our matched forms had similar predictive accuracy as the original forms. And when we looked at those simulated scores for our newly created matched inventories versus the scores from the words on the original CDI long forms, we saw there was almost a near perfect one-to-one correspondence between estimated scores, with correlations ranging from 0.98 to 0.99, which is super strong. And when we zoom out in this visual, you can see that each dot represents simulated scores, and dashed lines on each graph represent perfect one-to-one correspondence between our estimated scores and existing scores from the original CDIs. And so we can really conclude that these high correlations indicate that the matched inventories for English, Spanish, and for English Mandarin forms were accurately predicting children's vocabulary scores as they already are measured with existing CDIs. To sum up this portion of the work, we know that the matched inventories that we've created for dual language learners revealed comparable difficulty and discrimination abilities to the original forms, and they predicted CDI long form scores with near perfect accuracy. And so now moving on to our last goal. Now that we have both a matched and a valid tool, we wanted to know if these matched inventories would actually perform well when we ask them with real parents, right? And so, in a very familiar Brooklyn neighborhood of New York City, where Spanish, Mandarin, and English are commonly spoken, and where most families are first or second generation immigrant families to the US, we administered our adapted assessment in person and in interview format with 60 mothers of bilingual toddlers. And specifically, we saw that when we administered these matched forms, they revealed relatively low time burdens. So usually the short form for English, for Spanish, and for Mandarin, they're around 100 words long each, and they take about 10 minutes already to assess. But a matched form in English, Spanish, and English Mandarin took about 15 minutes to complete. And so compared to original kind of form lengths, we would say this is relatively low time burden. And it also gave us the ability to measure conceptual overlap or test concepts such as mutual exclusivity. And what this means is basically the idea that has been long held in bilingualism research, where we may see a bilingual child's vocabulary as giving them maybe different labels for, let's say, like a cup, right? If I assign this object, which is a cup, the word in English, cup, are children who are learning multiple languages at the same time also able to assign this cup with another word for cup? So like buoy, or for example, cup in Spanish. And with the matched forms, we're able to do that. And then lastly, we think we were able to get a more comprehensive representation of bilingual infants and toddlers' vocabularies compared to just that separate administration of non-matched forms. Okay, and so what this actually looked like, here I'm showing data from 22 English Mandarin bilingual children to help visualize how, compared to administering two original non-matched CDI forms, as you can see here in the light shades, the bars that are represented in the light shades, right? You see there's very little red, which represents the overlap. Our matched forms, the bars in the bold, reveal very different stories about these same children's bilingualism, right? And as expected, with our matched tools focusing in on the reds for each child, right? Because we were able to match the concepts, we saw that the proportion of overlapping words for most children, side by side, right, grew substantially. And for example, zooming in on some examples, like toddler number 20, with a dual administration of those original non-matched forms, we may have assumed that that child had more English vocabulary, right? When in reality, comparing the same concepts across languages, that child knew all the words they knew in English, right, in the green, in Mandarin as well. And so we know that maybe actually that child knew a lot more Mandarin words than we were giving them credit for. And then additionally, for toddler number 21, with the original forms, there may have been an assumption of this idea of mutual exclusivity, where, I might use a Spanish word to understand this concept of like a cup, but I might not give this same idea of a cup, that same label in English or in Mandarin. But that's not the case, right? With the matched forms, we saw indeed that there were lots of overlaps being concepts that they knew. Okay. And again, we see these divergent stories of bilingualism unfold when comparing the assessments of English-Spanish bilingual children. Again, if we're zooming in on some examples, the matched inventories, we think, really greatly improved our ability to observe overlapping concepts among dual language learners across languages in both English, Mandarin, and English, Spanish. Okay. To wrap up, our matched inventories really show great promise for advancing our vocabulary assessments of dual language learners. We can say they have strong psychometric properties, they're easily administered, and they reduce parent time burdens compared to doing two separate forms that don't even match. They yield a more comprehensive assessment of bilingual children's vocabularies. And if you adopt this measure, you're not sacrificing any original CDI scores. You can still pull those. And so, of course, this work would not have been possible without the families who participated in our project, the research team here at NYU's Plain Language Lab, and of course, our funders at New York City's Robin Hood Foundation. And of course, thank you all here at the Psych Café, but also in the Applied Psychology Department for helping fund the travel to this conference to disseminate this work. And thank you all for listening. I'm happy to open it up to questions. Awesome. Thank you.
Thank you, Kristy. That was a great presentation.
Yay. Yay. I'm glad.
Anybody have any questions?
Oh, thank you, Juliana.
No? Okay. You were super clear. Nobody has any questions. Okay. Well, thank you so much for presenting today, and we'll see everybody next time.
Awesome. Thank you both for organizing. Appreciate it. And thank you for coming. Yeah. Yay.
Thank you. Have a good one. Bye,
Thank
everybody.
you. Bye-bye.